The 4% rule is quite possibly the single most repeated, most widely cited number in the entire world of early retirement planning content today. Save 25 times your annual spending, withdraw 4% a year, and you're supposedly safe for life. It's also more contested among the people who actually study it than most retirement content lets on. Yet two separate retirees can follow the exact same rule, with the exact same starting balance, and end up in completely different situations, not because one of them made a mistake, but because of something that has nothing to do with their own decisions at all. Quick one before we get into this. If breaking down the real research behind retirement numbers is useful, hit subscribe. New video every week. This question matters for anyone with a retirement account, but it matters most acutely for early retirees specifically, people planning to leave full-time work well before a traditional retirement age. The gap between a 30-year plan and a 50-year plan is exactly where most of the real disagreement in this video actually lives. A safe withdrawal rate is the percentage of a retirement portfolio someone can withdraw in the first year of retirement, then adjust for inflation every year after, without running out of money before they run out of life. It's a single number trying to answer a genuinely hard question. How much can you spend from savings that also need to keep growing to support decades more spending after that? At a 4% rate, a $1 million portfolio supports $40,000 of spending in year one. Then, that $40,000 rises with inflation every year afterward, regardless of what the market actually does in any given year. That regardless of the market part is exactly where the real risk in this video comes from. The number traces back to a single study. Financial planner William Bengen published research in 1994 analyzing U.S. stock and bond returns from 1926 to 1992. His question was specific. What withdrawal rate could a retiree have taken, adjusted for inflation every year after, without running out of money over any 30-year period in that entire dataset? His final answer, exactly 15%, sometimes called his own safe max figure, the safe maximum, tested against every historical starting point in his data. A separate team published the Trinity study in 1998, using a similar methodology but shifting the framing. Instead of one single safe max number, they measured the success rate of different withdrawal rates across different time horizons. What percentage of historical 30-year periods a given withdrawal rate would have survived? Both studies became the intellectual foundation for the 4% rule, as it's commonly repeated today. Here's the part rarely mentioned alongside the 4% rule headline. Bengen has revised his own number since 1994, using updated data and a more diversified portfolio than his original study assumed. He now suggests 4.7% is sustainable for a 30-year retirement, meaningfully higher than his own original 4.15% figure. Morningstar, one of the most widely cited independent research firms in this space, arrived at a different, more conservative answer for 2026, 3.9%, based on their own forward-looking model of expected future returns rather than purely historical data. Read those two numbers side by side. 4,007% from Bengen himself, 3.9% from Morningstar, and the gap between them is nearly a full percentage point, on a question most people assume has one settled answer. On a $1 million portfolio, that gap is the difference between $39,000 and $47,000 of sustainable annual spending. A real, meaningful difference in someone's actual lifestyle, not a rounding error between two experts who broadly agree. The deeper, underlying reason a single universally safe number is genuinely so hard to pin down with any real confidence is a phenomenon called sequence of returns risk. It's not about the average return a portfolio earns over a retirement, it's about the order those returns arrive in. Two retirees can experience the exact same average annual return over the exact same 30 years and end up in dramatically different positions, purely based on whether the bad years landed early or late. The underlying mechanism driving this whole effect is actually fairly straightforward once it's made genuinely visible and explained clearly. Withdrawing that same fixed dollar amount from a portfolio that has already dropped meaningfully in value simply means being forced to sell off a noticeably larger percentage of whatever remains, just to generate that identical dollar amount of spending money. That noticeably larger percentage sold off early on simply has far less remaining left over to actually recover once the market eventually does rebound, meaning a financial wound that happens to occur early in retirement is genuinely, structurally worse for the portfolio than the exact identical wound happening much later would be, even though the actual dollar amount withdrawn was precisely the same either time around. Here's a simplified hypothetical illustration, not real historical data, just constructed to make the mechanism visible clearly. Two portfolios both start at $1 million, both withdraw a fixed $40,000 a year, 4%, and both average exactly 4.5% annual returns over 30 years. The only difference, one experiences a rough 4-year stretch, down 30%, down 15%, down 5%, up 3%, right at the start of retirement. The other experiences the identical 4 years, in the identical order, at the very end, after 26 years of steady 7% growth first. The portfolio that happened to hit the bad years first runs out of money entirely by year 24 of the simulation, a full 6 years before the 30-year retirement it was supposedly designed to fund had even actually ended. Meanwhile, the portfolio that hit the exact identical bad years last still has $1,572,073 remaining after the complete full 30 years have finished. Same withdrawal rate throughout, same average annual return throughout, and yet one portfolio completely ran dry years early, while the other more than kept, and even grew beyond its full original starting value. One detail that makes sequence risk even sharper in practice, the withdrawal amount isn't actually fixed at $40,000 forever. It rises with inflation every year, by design. So a retiree's spending power stays level over time. That means during a bad market year, a retiree isn't just withdrawing the same dollar amount from a shrinking portfolio, they're withdrawing a slightly larger amount than the year before, from a portfolio that's already lost value, which is precisely the combination that does the most damage early in retirement. This is also exactly why comparing withdrawal rates across different eras requires care. A 4% rate in a low-inflation decade behaves differently than the same 4% rate during a stretch of high inflation, since the built-in annual increase compounds the pressure on the portfolio either way. This is exactly why early retirement makes the safe withdrawal rate question genuinely harder, not easier. Benyen's original research, and most of what followed it, was built around a 30-year retirement horizon, reasonable for someone retiring at 65. Someone retiring at 35 or 40 potentially needs that same portfolio to last 50 years or more, not 30. Research extending the same modeling to longer horizons finds the sustainable rate drops as the time period grows. A 4% withdrawal rate that looks solid over 30 years carries meaningfully lower odds of lasting a full 50 years, since there's simply more time for a bad sequence to strike and less margin left to absorb it. This doesn't mean early retirement math is broken. It means the standard 4% figure built for a 30-year retiree needs real adjustment for someone planning a much longer one. It's worth understanding the actual testing method behind these numbers, since it explains why the answer keeps shifting. Both Benyen's original work and the Trinity study take every possible historical starting year in their dataset, run the identical withdrawal rate forward for the full time horizon from each one, and check whether the money lasted. A withdrawal rate that survived every single starting year in the data becomes the safe one. The entire figure is a statement about the past, not a guarantee about any future the data hasn't seen yet. Lower withdrawal rates naturally survive a higher share of historical starting points, and higher rates survive fewer, which is exactly why 3.9% and 4.7% can both be defensible answers depending on how much historical failure a researcher is willing to tolerate in their model, and how much they trust the future to resemble the specific past that's actually been measured. The research community's response to sequence risk isn't just pick a smaller percentage and hope. Flexible withdrawal strategies, spending less during a market downturn and more during strong years, rather than a fixed inflation-adjusted amount every single year, meaningfully improve a portfolio's odds of survival, since it's the forced selling during a downturn that does most of the damage. A dedicated cash buffer, held specifically to cover a year or two of spending during a market downturn, serves the same purpose. It lets a retiree avoid selling depressed investments at exactly the worst possible moment, buying time for a recovery instead of locking in losses through forced withdrawals. And for early retirees specifically, even a few years of part-time or flexible income. Sometimes called a bridge, early in retirement reduces how much the portfolio needs to withdraw during exactly the year sequence risk matters most, since it's disproportionately the first decade of withdrawals that determines whether a bad sequence becomes fatal to the whole plan. Asset allocation plays directly into this too. A portfolio still heavily weighted toward stocks right at the retirement date is more exposed to sequence risk than one that's shifted some weight toward bonds specifically in the years just before and just after retiring, since bonds are typically steadier, even though they historically grow more slowly, which is exactly the same trade-off already covered in this batch's video on getting to $1,000. Some retirement researchers specifically recommend a temporary increase in bond allocation right around the retirement date, sometimes called a bond tent, precisely to reduce how much a portfolio would lose if a downturn hits during those especially vulnerable first few years, then gradually shifting back toward stocks once the riskiest window has passed. For someone retiring well before a traditional retirement age, it's also worth remembering the portfolio isn't necessarily carrying the full load forever. Social Security benefits, once someone becomes eligible, typically supplement or partially replace portfolio withdrawals, meaning the heaviest sequence risk years are often the ones before that eligibility begins, not the entire retirement. This doesn't eliminate the early years risk this video is describing, but it does mean the portfolio's job usually gets lighter partway through a very long retirement, not harder. None of this is an argument against saving toward retirement, or against retiring early if the numbers genuinely support it. It's an argument against treating 4% as a guarantee rather than a starting estimate. Built on one specific historical dataset, that reasonable experts now put anywhere from 3.9 to 4.7%, depending on their assumptions. The practical takeaway is a range, not a single figure. Plan closer to the more conservative end if the retirement horizon is long or the portfolio's early years turn out rough, and revisit the plan periodically rather than setting a percentage once and never checking it again. The same check your numbers instead of guessing principle that's run through this entire batch of videos. A common piece of advice is simply reduce withdrawals during a crash, which is genuinely part of the fix already covered, but it's worth being honest that this is easier to model in a spreadsheet than to live through. A retiree still needs to cover rent, food, and healthcare regardless of what the market is doing that particular year, which is exactly why the cash buffer and flexible spending strategies matter as concrete tools, not just as a vague instruction to spend less when things get rough. The more useful version of this advice is a plan built in advance, with specific triggers decided before a downturn ever happens. For example, a predetermined percentage spending cut if the portfolio drops below a certain value, rather than an emotional decision made in the middle of a market panic, when clear thinking is hardest to come by. The 4% rule traces back to a single 1994 study of 1926 to 1992 returns, and even its own author now suggests 4.7% is sustainable, while Morningstar's own separate 2026 forward-looking model instead says 3.9%. The genuinely real risk sitting underneath both of those competing numbers is sequence of returns risk. The exact same average return can produce either a fully depleted portfolio or a completely intact one, purely based on when the bad years happen to land within the timeline, which matters most of all for anyone planning a retirement meaningfully longer than the standard 30 years. The word safe in this entire context was genuinely never meant to be an absolute guarantee of anything. It was always, from the very beginning, simply a historical estimate drawn from one specific dataset. Planning as though it's genuinely a range of reasonable outcomes rather than treating it like a firm promise is what actually protects an early retirement plan over time, far more than the specific decimal point someone ultimately chooses to use. This video is for educational purposes only and is not personalized financial advice. If this genuinely made your own personal retirement number feel more real and more concrete than before, go ahead and subscribe. New video every single week. Next time, we tested the 50-30-20 budget rule for 30 days.